learning and research are essential to teach today's scholars and to solve today's problems, not to mention tomorrow's. The natural and social sciences, the humanities, and the arts are all critical and in play as we tackle climate change and the environmental challenges that are affecting our health, our communities, and our economy here in Bloomington and around the world. So IPU was founded in 2012 by the provost and the leadership of the O'Neill School, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the School of Public Health to bring together all of the environmental and sustainability scholarship across the various schools and departments on the Bloomington campus. So ERI was founded in 2017 as part of the IU Prepared for Environmental Change Grand Challenge. Its mission is to enhance resilience to environmental change in Indiana and beyond by accurately predicting impacts and effectively partnering with communities to implement feasible, equitable, and research-informed solutions. So IPE and ERI faculty, staff, and students have worked together to bring us a full semester worth of speakers. Over the course of the semester, our speakers have and will address a wide range of topics from resilient agriculture in the face of climate change to advocacy in the energy transition to the development of an anti-racist science of ecology. Our last talk will be in 2 weeks on Friday, April 16th, featuring our very own Elizabeth Browning and Maria Whiteman, and they'll be presenting their art and history exhibition that explores Indiana's changing environment along the remains of the historic Monon Railroad, so mark your calendars. So you'll be able to find information about each talk on the ERI and IPE web pages and in the regular newsletters and upcoming events notices that our organizations regularly send out. And we encourage you to sign up for our newsletters so that you'll get reminders about these upcoming talks as well as other news and events that we publicize. If you have ideas for people we should consider for a future talk, please tell us that too. So finally, logistics on how you can engage with our speaker today. You can put questions into the chat box as you think of them. We will monitor them throughout the speaker's talk, and there will be an opportunity for questions at the very end. So at long last, please let me introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jackie McDonald Gibson. Gibson is professor and chair of environmental and occupational health here at IU Bloomington's School of Public Health. She received her PhD in engineering and public policy, as well as civil and environmental engineering from Carnegie Mellon University. Dr. Gibson's research seeks to illuminate what individuals, communities, and policymakers can do to make the biggest and most lasting improvements in public health by improving the quality of our environment. Her lab has worked across the globe, from the US to the United Arab Emirates, to examine environmental risks to health at the scale of communities. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Gibson.
Thank you so much, Lingxi, and thanks to everybody for being here today. I see some familiar faces, including some current and former students and postdocs and colleagues. So welcome to everybody. And again, thank you for taking the time. So the topic of my talk today is disparities in access to safe water and sanitation in the United States. And I think this topic is very timely with all of the news about the new proposed Biden infrastructure program. Of course, water and sanitation are critical infrastructure for public health. And I've been arguing for a while now that it's really time for major reinvestment to iron out and eliminate disparities that we have. So I'll talk a little bit just briefly about water and sanitation disparities in the US and give some examples of the kinds of disparities that exist. And then I'm going to spend most of the talk going in depth on one particular type of disparity that I've been working on for about the past decade. And that was based on work that I did when I was at the University of North Carolina. So it's really focused on water and sanitation disparities in North Carolina, but they're very representative of problems that exist nationwide. Before I get started on this topic of disparities, I would argue that the extent of disparities in access to clean water and safe sanitation in the United States are greatly under-recognized. There is a misperception, really, that just about everybody in this country can count on turning on the tap at their home and getting enough clean water for it to meet their daily needs. So just as an example, the United Nations keeps track of water and sanitation worldwide through what's called the Joint Monitoring Program. And according to the United Nations, you can see that the United States is colored in dark blue, meaning that 90 to 100% of the population has access to safe water. And in fact, if you dig into the data, it's close to 100%. That's what the United Nations has determined for the US. So, you know, if you were to look at United Nations data, you would think that our water problems in the US have been solved. The situation for sanitation in the US is recognized by the United Nations to not be quite as good overall. According to the United Nations, the estimate is that about 90% of residents of the US have access to safe sanitation. So still it's most people, not 100% as with water, but this is again according to the United Nations. Now, how does the United Nations define safe water and sanitation? For safe water, the definition is that the water is located on premises so that you don't have to take a hike every time you want water. It's available when needed. It's free of contamination. And the definition gives specific examples of what counts for access to safe water. They include piped water to the home, which of course is really what Americans really expect, but also various kinds of wells, protected springs, rainwater, and packaged or delivered water. Now, I would argue that most of us would really find it unacceptable to have to rely exclusively on rainwater or packaged or delivered water and not have piped water to the home. But nonetheless, these water sources are counted as safe water according to the United Nations definition. Safe sanitation, the definition is that the safe sanitation system is not shared with other households. It involves the safe disposal of human waste, either on-site or off-site, and it may include septic tanks, pit latrines, and composting toilets. Again, I think our aspirations in the US are that most people would not find pit latrines as an acceptable solution. Composting toilets may be in vogue in some places, but I'm betting most of us would not be satisfied with that either. So again, I would really argue that these United Nations definitions, which are widely used and highlighted to track water and sanitation access worldwide, really don't capture the kinds of disparities that exist in the US. And these disparities, except for occasional news headlines, remain mostly out of sight, but they exist every day all over the country. So of course, you know, water was in the news for a period of time during the Flint water crisis when the city of Flint, which is a deindustrialized city that's lost a lot of population over the years and so hasn't been able to afford to maintain its water infrastructure, suffered from a serious event when the city changed its water source, or was forced to under bankruptcy to try to save money, switched from highly treated water that they had been purchasing from Detroit, and instead started drawing water through an old water intake from surface water body that was very corrosive and released a lot of lead and other metals and other contaminants into the water supply across the city. And that did make the news. But there's many problems, again, that remain invisible. And I'd like to point out also there are many cities that are like Flint, but that just don't make the news headlines. You know, the water quality challenges aren't quite as dramatic, but there's a problem of these depopulating cities, majority minority cities that can't afford any longer to maintain their water infrastructure that was built for the days when the city was much larger and wealthier. Less visible, and I'd like to thank one of the members of our audience for this picture, Michelle Del Rio, who's about to defend her dissertation at the University of Texas, El Paso, and to join me at Indiana University. But this is a picture she sent of some communities where she's worked near El Paso, where people don't have piped water to the home at all, or wells, and they have to haul their water. So you can see this person is having to haul a tank of water to their house to meet their water needs. And I would argue again that this is not a situation that most of us would find acceptable in the United States. Of course, there are similar problems elsewhere. This is a picture from a colleague in Alaska who works with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, showing a kitchen that doesn't have a sink. that big bucket that looks like a trash can is actually water. So in this community, people have to haul their water from, they're called washaterias. Go to the washateria, fill a big trash bucket with water, bring it back to the house, and that measuring cup is actually used to dip water out of the bucket. Again, not a situation most of us would find acceptable. This is a picture of Catherine Flowers, who won a MacArthur Genius Award this past year for her work with communities in Alabama that face some very severe disparities in access to safe water and sanitation. Here she is standing in front of a failing septic tank, and you can see that pit is just basically untreated sewage. And again, apart from Catherine Flowers recently getting this Genius Award, these kinds of problems are largely invisible. And then I'd just like to point out, closer to home in Bloomington, we have a homeless population. This is a picture of their encampment that was in a local park. They were forced to move there, and now I've noticed that they've moved to the Bloomington Rail Trail, which I run on almost every day, and I see this encampment, and I see that people are getting their water from a creek, and of course don't have any toilets or latrines, and so I assume they're using the land around the creek, potentially contaminating their water, which isn't clean in the first place. So again, these are just examples of the kinds of populations in the US that really don't have access to safe water and sanitation, and that yet really fall under the radar of the typical programs used to monitor access to safe water and sanitation. And because this talk is for the Environmental Resilience Institute, which is all focused on helping communities build resilience to future climate change, I would just like to point out that these water and sanitation disparities really place these communities at extra risk in the face of extreme weather. So for example, when there are extreme storms, private wells flood and become contaminated. In one part of North Carolina where I work, southeastern North Carolina, during recent hurricanes, this has been a huge problem. It's a rural area. The wells have flooded and become contaminated with animal waste and cause major problems. Of course, if roadways flood, those who have to haul their water may not be able to get to their water source. And of course, those who rely on private wells, if the power goes out, their well pump won't work and they won't have access to water. And of course, during dry periods, those who rely on private wells, their wells may run completely dry. There may be increased competition and costs for hauled water for those who don't have water at home. And of course, under extreme heat conditions, not having reliable water at home can become a very serious health problem if you don't have enough water for hydration. So I just wanted to point out again that this is an issue that really is going to become increasingly important as the climate continues to change. So I'm going to shift now from that overview to again talk in detail to really give you a picture of one type of disparity in access to water and sanitation in the US that isn't captured at all in United Nations metrics and that really most people don't know about. And this situation occurs in many parts of the US, especially in the South and also in agricultural areas of the West. And these communities that I'm going to talk about, they are located in areas that are called extraterritorial jurisdictions, which I will explain in a moment. And so, like I said, over the last decade, actually, yeah, it's been a decade now, I've been working on understanding, what is the role of race in people's access to water and sanitation services in these areas? And in these areas that are really underserved, what are the kinds of water quality and health challenges that people face? How does this situation affect their activities of daily life? And what can potentially be done about this? So I want to thank, before I even get started, the former state health director of North Carolina, Dr. Jeff Engel. I really began this work at his encouragement. About 10 years ago, I sort of believed those joint monitoring program metrics. I really thought that our water supply problems in the US were mostly solved. People could really count on being able to turn on water. I'm trained as an environmental engineer, and when I was going through my training, I thought, well, we've really generally solved water supply problems in the US, nothing super interesting for me to do there. But I was fortunate enough to have lunch with Dr. Engel when he was new in his position as state health director. And I just happened to ask him, as in your new role, what are your biggest priorities? And he said one of them was that he'd heard a lot of anecdotal stories of racial disparities in access to safe water and sanitation, but really hadn't been able to get any data on whether these really existed, beyond some anecdotal stories. If so, what these disparities meant for people's health. And as health director, of course, water and sanitation is at the absolute foundation of public health. It's public health 101 that you need to make sure people have safe drinking water and sanitation to control infectious diseases. And of course, address other health risks as well. So it was with his motivation that I got started on this. He later went on to become the executive director of the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists. So a little bit of background on the kinds of communities that I've focused on. You will hear me use the term throughout this presentation, ETJ. And ETJ stands for extraterritorial jurisdiction. And an extraterritorial jurisdiction is an area that's unincorporated just outside the boundaries of a city or town. Under North Carolina law and law in some other states as well, cities and towns can claim zoning authority over some of these areas. In North Carolina, they're allowed to control zoning and development in these areas up to 3 miles beyond the town limits. What this means for property owners is that the town or city is controlling what they can do with their land, but the property owners in these areas don't get to vote in municipal elections, so they really don't have any voice in these zoning decisions. They also are not guaranteed access to municipal services. This includes water, sewer, trash, police, fire, and city park access, even if they are right next to the city, or in some cases like a little island in the middle of the city. They're not guaranteed these services. Now, the city may elect to extend services, but they're not obliged to under law. So to show you what this looks like, I'm going to pull up some examples. This map is courtesy of an organization called the Cedar Grove Institute for Sustainable Communities that's worked on these kinds of disparities in access issues in North Carolina and elsewhere around the country. And so this is showing the town of Mebane in North Carolina. It's very close to Chapel Hill, where the University of North Carolina is, again, where I was for 12 years. In yellow are the town boundaries. The colors here indicate the demographic composition. So the dark orange areas are mostly African American. The white areas are, of course, white. And you'll see some interesting patterns. Like I mentioned, here's a little island. This little African American community is not part of the town officially. The purple lines show the extraterritorial jurisdiction boundaries. So what this means is the folks who live in this town and the town council here, they get to tell folks who live in these areas between the yellow and the purple lines what they can do with their land, but they're not obliged to provide any services to those folks. And the folks who live here don't get to vote in the municipal elections. So again, the municipal boundaries, you'll see that there are several African American communities that are excluded. This is a map of the sewer lines that was prepared by the Cedar Grove Institute about a decade ago when I got started working on this issue. You'll see the sewage treatment plant, which is across the street from this African American community. And you can see how the sewer lines extend into these white communities, but bypass these African American communities. The city decided to annex a bit of land way out here and incorporate it and extend water lines out there, bypassing these historically African American communities on the way. Now, there is a bit of good news out of this, which is after decades of lobbying, the group that lives in this community here was able to finally get connected to the sewer, but these other communities remain unserved. And again, this was a huge battle for them that they worked on for years, but you can see this kind of pattern. Another example is a community that I've worked with. It's called the Iron Gate neighborhood. You'll see it here in orange. And again, this orange indicates the racial composition. It's nearly 100% African American. What you see here in blue are the water lines for the town of Apex. Now, Apex is one of the wealthiest suburbs in North Carolina. What you can see from this is that the water lines stop right here at the entrance to the Iron Gate neighborhood. And several years ago, I was contacted by this gentleman, Mr. Robert Lassiter. He'd been organizing his community and trying for a while to get the attention of the town to see if they could get access to the community water service. Right here, this fire hydrant is located right here. And periodically, the town would flush its water mains by releasing water through this fire hydrant. It would run down the road here through Iron Gate. But meanwhile, there were houses in this community whose wells had really literally run dry and didn't have water for activities of basic, daily life, like showering, doing laundry, washing dishes. In one of these houses, I believe it's this one here, the well was completely dry and they had paid $10,000 to drill a deeper well and it still was dry. So big problems. And I noticed, by the way, a couple of my former students are on the line, Sydney Lockhart, who worked with this community with me. And I'll tell you more about that story toward the end of the presentation. But these kinds of extraterritorial jurisdictions, they exist all across the state of North Carolina, and again, in many other states as well. And what you can see here, all of these little colored areas are these extraterritorial jurisdictions. The white areas in the middle are the town that's claimed zoning authority over these areas. So they're all over the state. And what I wanted to do, when Dr. Engel told me about his concerns, I began reading up a little bit, and I found some interesting papers by sociologists and demographers that talked about this issue of whether there were disparities in infrastructure access in sort of the peri-urban or municipal fringe areas of southern cities and towns. And I found this really interesting literature, and this is just a paper by a sociologist who's now at Cornell. The paper is called Municipal Underbounding, Annexation and Exclusion in Small Southern Towns. And basically, these sociologists and demographers defined a term called underbounding. And the way they've defined that is that it's basically the situation like I showed you in Mebane and Iron Gate, where the majority white municipality does not agree to incorporate or annex these majority Black areas at the fringes of the town. And why do they not do that? Well, one hypothesis is that this could unsettle the racial balance of power within local municipalities. So there's some, again, really interesting research by sociologists and demographers that really documents this problem. And it really goes all the way back to the Reconstruction era when freed slaves were given land, but it was typically on the outskirts of town in some of the least desirable locations. And that footprint still remains in many areas. So again, I wanted to begin by looking at, well, we do have these anecdotal tales like the Mebane community and the Iron Gate community, but is there really an association between race and access to water service in these underbounded or these extraterritorial jurisdiction areas? They're not all majority minority areas. And I wanted to start looking into this question at the request of Dr. Engel. And he had actually asked his county health directors, all 100 county health directors, to try to help. And they basically didn't have data on who in their jurisdiction had access to community water and sanitation. And this, one of the reasons is that up until 1990, the US Census asked people, where do you get your water? These are questions from the 1990 census that you can see here. And people could say, do they get their water from a public system, such as a city water department or private company? Or do they get their water from an individual drilled well or dug well or some other source? Similarly, the next question asked respondents if they're connected to a public sewer, if they're connected to a septic tank or cesspool, or no, they use other means. But after 1990, again, I would argue because of this misperception that our water and sanitation problems in the US have been solved, this question was dropped from the census. And there is no place to go nationally or even at the state level in the US where you can find out at the household scale what kind of access do people have to water and sanitation services. And this poses a really tremendous challenge to identifying areas in need of assistance. What I did discover in my inquiries, though, that a couple of counties in North Carolina keep information on water and sanitation access as part of their property tax records. So these counties are Wake County, which is where the capital is located. In red, you'll see it here, population about 1 million, a very wealthy county in the state with a median income of 81,000, 72% white, 20% black. And for every property in the county, every single property, every house, they have fields in their property tax records that indicate whether that property has a connection to a public water supply and to a sewer system. The same is true in Halifax County. Halifax County is a county of a very different nature, population of 50,000, a much lower income, just $26,000, and it's majority Black county, 53% Black. So with wonderful students over the years, we have looked into whether we see explicit evidence of racial discrimination and access to municipal services in these areas. So we began with Wake County a number of years ago. That was kind of the first data set we were able to find, and some of my students developed this map. This is a map zooming in on Wake County. And what you see here, the color scheme, everything in yellow is part of a city or town. It's incorporated into a city or town. Therefore, legally, the city must provide access to all municipal services to folks within the town boundary, including water and sanitation. Everything that's gray is classified as rural, and everything that's another color is in an extraterritorial jurisdiction. I did mention that cities and towns can elect to extend infrastructure for water and sanitation into these extraterritorial jurisdictions, or in some cases, these extraterritorial jurisdictions may have their own public water supplies. And so all of these areas in light blue do have access to a community water system, but all the areas in dark red and salmon don't have access to a community water supply. The interesting thing is you can see some of them are really right in the middle of a city, like this little neighborhood here. You know, these little neighborhoods here is very interesting pattern. You know, they're all surrounded by water infrastructure. As you can see here, for example, this area is surrounded by the city here, and then a community that does have where service was extended from the city. But our question was whether, does race really play a role in whether these folks get access to the water infrastructure, community water infrastructure? And we found a very strong signal. This here is the proportion proportion of people in the census block whose house has a connection to a regulated water system. And you'll see that this declines as the African-American population proportion increases. So areas that are, you know, majority African-American have lower access to these community water services in these areas that are right next to or surrounded by these services than communities that are white. And this was a very strong relationship. More recently, I'd like to credit Banks Grubbs, who's a current undergraduate at UNC graduating this semester, and did an honors research project to look into Halifax County and see whether the same pattern exists there. And Halifax County is one of the other counties that happens to have water and sewer access data available at the county level. And so this is a map he created. Now, there's a lot going on here. What you see here, the areas encircled in red are basically the cities and towns. Really, the only city in the county here is Roanoke Rapids. All of the properties in green have city water and sewer. All of the properties in blue have city water. Anything in red is relying on both a private well and a septic system. So you can see, just, you know, kind of looking at this pattern, you do see some red folks here who are getting their water from a private well rather than a community system, even though they are right next to areas that have city water. So the blue and the green have city water. And so what did Banks find? This is like hot off the presses. He's defending his undergraduate thesis soon, and this is the results of his statistical analysis that what this chart shows is basically the odds of a household having a connection to a regulated community water system relative to a household in an area that's 100% white. So for areas that are 100% white, you know, the odds ratio here is 1. That's the comparator. But what you can see is this very significant decline. So as you get up here to areas that are 100% Black, the odds of having a connection to a regulated water system are about 70% less than if you're in an area with a white system. And this is, again, very statistically significant. Banks also found the same sort of pattern goes on for sewer access. You're much more likely to have a sewer service if you live in one of these areas that's at the edge of a city or town, but it's a white area than you are if it's a Black area. And just looking in more detail at Halifax County, again, this is data from Banks that's so interesting. It's a majority Black county, 53% Black, but the main city is majority white. So you see this pattern of underbounding here, this map from Banks. The purple shading shows the racial composition. The light purple areas are mostly white, and the dark purple areas are, you know, people of color, and you can see how they're sort of congregated here around the edges of the cities. And, you know, same in these other cities, although these little labels are blocking it a bit. So you see the town is wealthier, it's whiter, and that's where people have access to municipal services. So again, this is a pattern that really dates to an era of kind of majority white municipalities not wanting to incorporate these communities of color into their jurisdictions. So what is the problem with these? So in these communities, people rely on private wells and septic systems. And over the years, I talked to many people and say, well, what's the problem with the private well? You know, I grew up with a private well. My grandma has a private well. So my concern about these communities is that they're in relatively densely populated areas right up against the edges of cities and towns. And anywhere you have more population density, you have more risks of contamination. So it's not like these are remote rural areas, pristine areas potentially. You also, a high density of septic systems also could pose a risk. So my students and I began testing water quality in these communities. And this work was led by my former PhD student, Frank Stillo, shown in this picture here with me and a resident of one of these communities. And this is a map of Wake County again. All the yellow areas are these extraterritorial jurisdictions without water service. And what Frank did is recruit people from these areas to have us come in and test water quality. And again, I'm zooming in here because you'll just see this really interesting pattern. These little neighborhoods of color where people are relying on private wells and septic systems, and yet everybody here in dark blue and in light blue has the community water service. So a very interesting pattern. So when we started this work, we were running on a really low budget. And so our ability to do testing at the time was limited, but we focused on contaminants that are really major concerns for public health. Of course, we all know that the foundation of infectious disease control is adequate water and sanitation. So we first looked at bacterial contaminants to see if there was any indication that these communities might be at risk of fecal contamination of their well water. And then lead is a long known neurotoxin, and of course was the metal of concern, or the contaminant of concern in the Flint water crisis. It causes permanent neurocognitive damage in young children when they're exposed. So that was the focus of our initial testing. Here's Frank in the mass spec lab at UNC getting some samples prepared. And here's some undergrads who worked with us in the UNC environmental microbiology lab getting some samples prepared for bacterial analysis. And all of this is published, so I'm going to skip right ahead to the results. But what you're seeing here is from these water samples that Frank and the students collected, this chart shows the proportion testing positive for various types of microbes that indicate a potential risk that the water might be contaminated with human or animal fecal material. You'll see that 2/3 of the wells from these communities tested positive for at least one. By comparison, municipal water samples, data provided by the municipal water system for the city of Raleigh, barely ever test positive for any of these things. They're tested for E. coli and total coliforms. Of special concern, Enterococcus is a really good marker of potential contamination with human fecal waste, and 28% of the wells tested positive for those. So that was somewhat alarming. Now for lead, what Frank found is that 28% of the houses that he tested, here this is a histogram showing the number of houses that had more lead than is allowable for regulated water systems under the lead and copper rule of the Safe Drinking Water Act. That level is 15 micrograms per liter. And so 28% of these houses had more lead than would be allowable in a community water supply. So this, I should point out, is an action level that triggers action when community water supplies detect more than this amount of lead in 10% of their households. They have to take aggressive action to improve their corrosion control and try to also eliminate potential sources of lead in the distribution system. I'd like to point out that that prevalence of elevated lead is quite similar to what was observed in Flint during the water crisis. So this table is adapted from a paper about the water crisis from Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, the pediatrician who really rose to the challenge and helped the community during this crisis. Flint, Michigan is divided into 9 wards, and what you'll see here is that in the most affected wards at the height of the water crisis, 28 to 32% of houses had elevated lead. So whereas what we were seeing in these extraterritorial jurisdictions of North Carolina, about 28% had elevated lead, but nobody's really paying attention to these communities, doesn't make the news. So we then went on, and I'm going to breeze right through this because this is also published, but we looked at, well, what's this doing to people's health potentially? With bacterial contaminants, we worry about infectious diseases, and we were able to get a data set of emergency department visits for acute gastrointestinal illness to try to link those to people's water source and the quality of their well water. And we were able to also get a data set of every child in Wake County, North Carolina, tested for blood lead over the last 20 years and match that up with water source. And so what we found, this result was published in the American Journal of Public Health a few years ago, that about 22% of these emergency department visits for very severe acute gastrointestinal illness could be attributable in these extraterritorial jurisdiction areas to contamination of the private wells with bacterial contaminants. This article was published last summer in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and there's a lot going on here, but what this is showing is the change in blood lead for different conditions. So up here at the top, I'm showing a comparison of city water compared to kids with city water, kids with well water in Wake County, where I focused a lot of my research, have lead levels that are about 25% higher. So again, we're seeing this strong signal suggesting that the lead in the well water in these communities is leading to increased exposure to lead. This is all well water in the Wake County, including wells in rural areas, so not in these extraterritorial jurisdictions, but the risks are compounded in these extraterritorial jurisdictions and low-income areas. So here you'll see this little flag here that says, for kids who live in these extraterritorial jurisdictions just beyond city and town boundaries, they also have higher blood lead levels than kids who live in the town. So you're kind of piling on lack of community water, whatever else is going on in these areas that we don't know about, other sources of lead exposure. And then of course, blood lead increases as income decreases. So, or in other words, kids with higher incomes have lower blood lead levels. So in these low income extraterritorial jurisdictions without water, you have these multiple factors contributing to elevated blood lead. And of course, there remains a racial disparity in blood lead. In this country, it's a nationwide thing that goes on. You can see it very clearly in this data set that that kids who live in majority Black neighborhoods have higher blood lead levels than kids in white areas. So I'm going to talk really briefly, and this is really not to be shared beyond this audience, but the next step we wanted to do is say, well, we know lead's a neurotoxin. We know, and we've shown that lack of community water surface translates into higher lead in the water, which translates into higher blood lead levels in children. Do we see any effects on behavioral outcomes? And we were able to get from the North Carolina Department of Public Safety reports of any juvenile delinquency records for all of the kids in our database, 60,000 kids for whom we have blood lead measurements and water source information. And we are now finalizing an analysis, but what we found is that kids who have higher blood lead levels have a highly significant increase of having any report for juvenile delinquency, and an even higher risk for a serious offense. And this kind of what we're showing now with our models is that this is kind of we're seeing this causal chain in action, that you can attribute a portion of this increased risk to the risk of lead exposure due to lack of community water service in these areas. So I should back up and point out, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but one more thing I want to cover, and I'll wrap up, is effects of on activities of daily life. So I mentioned in this Iron Gate community, Cindy Lockhart, my former student on the line here, did this research where she interviewed households in Iron Gate who told her that 60% of the people there said that their well water failed to provide enough water more than once a year, 5% once a year. So a lot of people were experiencing water quality or water quantity issues, not just the quality issues. And to sort of drive this home, I wanted to show this picture. This is a gentleman that I met who lives in an extraterritorial jurisdiction of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And that underneath that tarp is his well. And he's got it all wrapped in blankets because when the weather gets cold, the pipes freeze and his well stops working. And then he's got to haul water until he can afford to bring someone over to get it fixed. So he is without water when his well freezes, and he tries to deal with this by wrapping it in blankets. So these are real problems. And again, I would argue that these really fly under the radar and they're not captured in monitoring programs. This is more of Sydney's work from the Iron Gate community. She asked people what measures they had to take when they didn't have enough water from their wells. Folks said they weren't able to take showers. They had to limit flushing of toilets, rely on bottled water, not do dishes, etc. Go to the laundromat. So there are real implications for people. I think I'm running low on time, so I'm going to just talk very briefly about solutions. Solutions for the water quality problem. There is a short-term solution, which is that people could install water filters. One of my current PhD students, Riley Mulhern, is just wrapping up his dissertation research looking at how well these work for removing various chemical and microbial contaminants from the water. These do really well for removing chemical contaminants. They don't really improve the microbial quality of the water, though. So the water would still need to be disinfected. Another thing, of course, is they don't solve the water quantity problems. Another of my students who's on the line, April Disclaus, is about to defend her master's thesis, where she actually worked with the Iron Gate community due to a great lobbying campaign and work by many of my students documenting what the community was facing. The city finally agreed to annex that community and extend water service. And this is a picture from about last April of water lines getting ready to go in. So April jumped on it, and despite the pandemic, enrolled households from this community to see what happened with their water after they got connected to the Apex water supply. And that did solve the lead problems and, of course, the water quantity problems in that community. Now, why does city water pose lower risk for lead exposure? When cities are doing what they're supposed to do, they monitor lead throughout their distribution system, and they treat the water with corrosion inhibitors that form a protective scale that prevents the release of lead from household plumbing. What went wrong in Flint is the failure to adequately control the corrosivity of the water, and therefore the release of lead that had been stored up in that scale over decades. But what April's shown here is, again, for the lead problem and the water quantity problem, connecting to municipal water was a good solution. Problem is, it's very costly. For this one small community, this town of Apex, the cost was about between $200,000 and $300,000. They were able to get a community development block grant with help from the county to cover most of that, but the homeowners still had to pay a one-time connection fee that was quite substantial, and also pay a plumber to connect their house to the water line. And now they'll have water bills, and not everybody was able to afford to do that. So my big summary here, moving on, is that, well, this is a problem of money, not technology. We have the technology, we need the money. It's an argument for putting some of that infrastructure spending toward eliminating disparities in access to safe water and sanitation in the US. These disparities are not adequately captured with the kinds of statistics that are collected. I'd also argue that we really need to add back that question to the census about where people get their water. So again, there are case studies around the nation. I've shown you a lot of detail about what's going on in North Carolina, but North Carolina shouldn't be singled out in any way because these problems occur everywhere and they're largely invisible. And like I said, we have the solutions. It's just a matter of the political will and the funding. So I would recommend a federal program to eliminate these disparities with funds that would support extending infrastructure. Again, many towns can't afford these costs. Should also include where infrastructure extension or improvements aren't feasible. For example, in rural areas, technical and financial support so people can afford to monitor their well water quality and provide and maintain treatment systems if it's necessary. And with that, I would like to thank my many wonderful students. Some of them are on the line. These are current and former students who have helped on this work over the last decade. Just a fantastic group of people. And I'd also like to thank the funding agencies that have supported this work, beginning with a tiny little Junior Faculty Development Award at the University of North Carolina, and then awards from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, EPA, and the North Carolina Policy Collaboratory. And there's many publications on this from my group and others. And I will wrap up now because I don't want to take up all the time for questions. I think I've talked too long already, but if anybody wants any of these publications, feel free to contact me, or if you want the list of other relevant publications, let me know.
Thank you, Dr. Gibson, for that really fascinating presentation on inequalities in drinking water and sanitation. I think your research is so important because it goes to just show how widespread environmental, racial injustices are in this country, particularly when, high publicity events like the Flint water crisis, while they may draw attention to the problems, might kind of suggest that they're one-off problems instead of system level problems. Okay, so we have a couple of questions coming in. Do you think Biden's infrastructure plan will address some of the issues that you raised in your presentation?
That is a great question. I know that there is funding to replace lead service lines. I haven't looked in detail at the plan to see what other kinds of funding are available. I'm hoping they will pay attention to this kind of research, though, because, again, replacing lead service lines, that will help in some places, but it's not going to solve problems in places like El Paso, where people are having to haul water, or in these extraterritorial jurisdiction communities.
Right. So we have another question from Gabe Filippelli. There's a quick question about BLL. Did you control for other lead sources like soil? In Flint, they found that even during the peak of the crisis, soil-sourced PBE contributed about 50% of the total BLL for African American populations.
Yes, that is such a great question. Hi, Gabe. Anyway, and Gabe is a world expert on lead in exposure, especially in urban areas. But what we controlled for is the year the house was built, because other sources, predominant sources of lead include old paint, and also, of course, legacy lead from gasoline. The best we could do in this case was, again, to control for the year of construction. So lead paint, I believe, was banned in 1978. I think I've got the right year. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. And then phased out after that. Leaded gasoline was also phased out during the end of the 20th century, so that we kind of hope that by controlling for this, we're capturing those other sorts of effects. And of course, what you can see is that this is showing that compared to houses built before 1950, houses built more recently, the children have lower levels of lead, kind of progressively lower over time in the newer houses, again, because of the phase out of lead paint. But ideally, right, we would have known something about the soil lead that was going on here as well.
Right. Gabe says, Jackie, that makes sense. Another question from the audience: since Flint, have the communities that you've been working with more interested in participating in your research? So not just the communities that you work with, but other communities. Have they become more interested in or active in advocating for change in safe water?
That is a really great question. Well, I think in the case of the Iron Gate community, they contacted me for help because they were worried about their serious water quality problems and also water quality. They had visible sediment and things in their water, particularly when the water table was low. I will say it takes an enormous effort from these communities to try to address these issues. And imagine trying to work your job, raise your kids, and then having to go to battle to try to just get basic infrastructure services. And it's really the rare community that has a leader who's willing to step forward. That Mebane community that I showed you a map of, they had a leader like that. It took them a very long time, to fight that battle. And so I think in most places, people just, don't have the time and resources to try to fight that battle. As far as willingness to participate in my study, people are very willing to participate in getting free water tests. I've discovered that's not really been a big problem. We do have a study going on where we're also trying to enroll kids to get a blood test at the same time as a water test. That one's more challenging. People don't love having to get their kid pricked with a needle. But yeah, I would just say again, I think, trying to leave these problems up to the local communities to try to advocate for themselves is just too much. That's why we need a national program to uncover these problems, figure out where they're happening, and put some funding towards solving them.
Right. A follow-up to that question. So I'm wondering if annexation of the ETJs, along with substantial injection of federal funding, is kind of one obvious solution. And if so, what are the obstacles? Do communities living in ETJs want to be annexed? Do you know anything about the process by which these extraterrestrial jurisdictions can be annexed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So North Carolina law was changed just a few years ago. And now with a petition, I believe it has to be from 100% of property owners. If 100% of property owners petition for annexation, then the city must do it. And then they have a certain amount of time to provide water to extend infrastructure into those areas. There's a lot of news about annexation issues in the, it's called the Triangle region of North Carolina, where the university is in Raleigh and Wake County and all that, because in addition to these underbounded communities, there are wealthy communities that are largely white where folks have elected to live outside the town boundary, like on a big estate. And those folks don't want to be annexed, they want to just kind of be left alone. I think that, I can't really speak for everybody who lives in these kinds of communities. From survey work that we've done with these underbounded communities, the majority of people would prefer to have city water if they could afford it. In the Iron Gate community, they had to get everybody on board with the annexation concept. So everybody in the community, again, was on board with annexation. And that means, of course, they have to pay higher taxes. They were willing to do it to get access to the city services. So I think, that's a bit of a complicated question. It depends on the community.
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of an interesting.
And I will,
question.
yeah, I'll say that even though Iron Gate was annexed by Apex, Apex has no plans to extend sewer. That's going to cost a fortune. It's going to be more than $500,000. And even though the law says they must offer to do so within a certain period of time, I think that what they're probably going to say is that the community needs to pay for it. There's simply no way they'll be able to do that.
Right, and that might be a place where federal funding can come in
Mm-hmm.
to close that gap. So we have last two questions, which I'm going to combine. So first part of the question, are there any success stories? Second part of the question, Sarah Mincy asks, is there a role for green infrastructure as opposed to gray infrastructure in improving access to safe water, sanitation?
Or what did I miss one word for what infrastructure?
Green infrastructure.
Oh, green infrastructure.
Right.
Oh, okay, great. So are there success stories? I would argue that the Iron Gate community is a huge success story. It's one of the happiest days of my life as a researcher, you know, when the town of Apex agreed to annex that community, because the situation there was really dire. But that's such a small success story. There's other small stories like that around too. But again, I don't think these battles should be fought one at a time. As far as green infrastructure, actually, I've talked to the former director of the North Carolina Division of or Department of Environmental Quality, who said, you know, why not use solving these problems as an opportunity to rethink infrastructure? And you know, I think there could be that opportunity, maybe to have kind of gray water reuse systems built in conjunction with these infrastructure extensions. I don't think, though, that it's a good idea to say, for example, have these communities rely on harvested rainwater that's not treated, you know, or composting toilets. I think we have other sorts of aspirations in the US, and I don't think we should have, you know, people without opportunities to access the best of what we have to offer.
Right. Okay, so we have a bit of time for one last question. Someone in the audience asks, in Texas, where communities don't have reliable water from a well, we have helped them meet their needs to non-potable water with rain harvesting. Okay, so you actually just addressed this, but
Yeah.
question about North Carolina, is rain harvesting legal in North Carolina or here in Indiana?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't believe it's legal in North Carolina. You can use it for watering yards, but not for household water. I don't know about Indiana. Of course, the problem with rainwater harvesting is then it leaves the burden on the individual homeowner to make sure their rainwater is treated. When it's stored for a long time, it can become contaminated.
Right, and that runs into all the problems that you talked about in your
Right.
presentation. Right. Well, with that, I want to thank our speaker, Dr. Gibson. That was a fascinating presentation, and so thank you so much. Please tune in for our last talk of the spring series in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.